Bishop Graham, welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time this morning.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Bryn. Thank you.
It's a one-off for me to be sat just a couple hundred metres away from our coffee shop in the Bishop's house, drinking coffee and talking justice. So I'm really excited to have this time with you this morning. I just thought we'd start. It's pretty routine for me to start by talking about coffee. And you mentioned a minute ago before we started recording you'd had a recent trip to Papua New Guinea and you'd brought back some coffee for some of your friends back here. Where does coffee feature in your life? Do you drink much?
Well, I used to not like coffee at all. Right. It was until I became an adult that I drank coffee. And I still can't stand coffee cake or tiramisu and desserts with coffee in. I just don't go for them at all. And actually, as I've kind of entered my 50s, I'm afraid I've had to really cut back on coffee. So I have a very occasional coffee, which I really enjoy. But I know if I have more than one, as I did in Rome last week one morning, I start having the shakes. And then I don't get a good night's sleep. So I enjoy the coffee in Rome, but I then paid for it. So I sort of kind of one really lovely coffee a week kind of guy.
Oh, one a week? Gosh, well, it has to be really lovely if you're going to treat yourself to
And when in Papua New Guinea, there was, for my birthday, we went out and had coffee and cake and into a really very lovely restaurant in the capital. And they did that swirly bit on the top.
The latte
but it was a bird of paradise.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, the design. It was stunningly beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing what people could do. My latte art's okay, but one of my baristas is very good at doing those sort of things. I thought we'd start by just introducing people who are less familiar with the Church of England, less familiar with Anglicanism. What's a bishop? What's your role as a bishop in terms of its sort of more traditional role, but also in practical terms? How do you spend your time?
Yeah, well, a bishop in a sense is an overseer. So somebody who is appointed to look after, to care, to steward, to guide, to protect, to encourage. And in a sense, those are all aspects of my role. Of course, the symbol of being a bishop is a shepherd's crook. We're to try to be the shepherds of God's flock, imitating, Jesus and stories that he told about himself. And so a shepherd's crook is there to guide, to encourage, at times prod and poke. But I rather like the image of a shepherd's crook planted in the ground so you can stand totally still and kind of swivel round and get a 360-degree view of what's going on. So my day, every single day is different. That's rather the joy of this role. And the great privilege of this role is that every day I kind of get up, I'm excited about the day because it is different. And that's been the huge privilege of following this calling throughout my life. And it can involve all kinds of different things in any one day.
Yeah, amazing. That does sound like a privilege. So you're on a podcast called the Justice and Coffee podcast because I've invited people that I believe justice is a big feature of their life, part of their ministry, part of their calling, their careers. And I see you as the same. But I wonder how you interpret that word justice.
Justice is trying to find the dignity of every human being made in the image of God and allowing them to flourish into the full human beings that they're called to become. And the reality in our world is that so many external forces prevent people finding life in all its fullness. And when that's being prevented, that's very often because of injustices against that person, that group of people. It's not allowing their true flourishing.
Yeah, I like that description. Have you always felt called? Do you see that as a feature of your position? Or is it just part of your personality, a calling to pursue justice, a sensitivity to justice and injustice? Where did that begin for you?
I think it began probably in my student days in Edinburgh. I was quite influenced by a range of different people, the apartheid movement, in early stage of environmental justice, racial justice. I was involved with something called the British Youth Council, where these things were very high on the agenda. And I guess I began to learn more, to understand more. And for me, every day is a kind of school day. I'm always learning. I'm always trying to address the injustices that I carry and look at that. But, it impacts on my life in all kinds of ways at the moment, because, I believe to live a Christian life is to be involved in trying to make a better society. And certainly, my role in the House of Lords as a bishop in the House of Lords is always about trying to shape things better for people to live life in all its fullness. And we often get told, why? Keep out of politics. For goodness sake, keep out of politics. Why are you involved in politics? Well, turn the page of the Bible and you keep seeing how people's lives should be and could be better. And so to live out my calling as a Christian is to try to bring about change where I see injustice. And so, of course, Christianity is involved with politics, because politics is about the whole people of God, the polis, the home, the community we try to create. And we want to create a better society.
I was going to ask you about your role within the House of Lords and what you would say to those that challenge the association of church and state and the intermingling of those things. But I think effectively you just have covered that.
But it is a huge privilege, and it goes deep into the fabric of our constitutional life in this country, of our history. And whilst there is this privilege, I hope I can use my voice wisely, carefully, reflectively, to champion particularly people in Norfolk and Waveney, for whom I'm their bishop, but also to try to, in a world increasingly divided, an increasingly divided society, just offer some reflections into that to see how could we live a better life together that enables more people to have life in all its fullness.
I was going to come to that, but since you brought it up, I think it's worth us exploring that a little bit, because I feel that we are in an increasingly divided period of recent social history. There seems to be, even within Christianity, Christian circles, quite polarizing views, accelerated by the emergence of technology, of internet connectivity, of social media, of the development of artificial intelligence, and list all those other contributing factors. We feel we're potentially pulling apart, even within the church, but certainly outside society. And I wonder how you see that, whether you share that observation, and how you respond to that as a bishop, and how you would suggest a Christian respond to that.
Well, I do see it. I see it all the time. I'm seeing it on the streets of our country, and the political narrative and rhetoric we see. And it is deeply disturbing. I speak to Muslims in Norwich who are afraid. I've been in regular contact with the Jewish community who are afraid, and particularly after the killings in Manchester, the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing. This is all deeply, deeply disturbing, and I want to kind of I also use the phrase "the thing under the thing." This is presenting factors. What's going on underneath? And obviously there are deep concerns about the levels of migration. Partly those concerns are fueled because people can't get access to health, the waiting lists are longer, they see increasing challenges in their own lives and the cost of living, etc. And they feel that resources are not being shared freely. So I think there is a public conversation that needs to happen about some of the underlying concerns that people have, and to take those concerns very, very seriously, whilst at the same time being very, very clear as a Christian leader that we are taught by Jesus to love our neighbour, and that is a challenge. How do we really love our neighbour? How do we care for the lost, the least, and the lonely, those who are marginalised in our society? Every summer I invite refugees from across Norfolk to come here for an afternoon in the garden. And they all bring food to share. And it is the most joyous afternoon, really, of my year. Yeah. It's a beautiful, beautiful time together. Because this city of Norwich has a tradition of being a welcoming city. This fine city that has seen different waves of migration over its history. You know, why we have the strangers idea here, that, you know, strangers come and are welcomed. So how do we live that for today, whilst balancing the very genuine concerns that people have? But, you know, I'm deeply troubled by the use of the Christian cross, the use of the St. George's flag, which has a kind of irony about it, of course, because St. George was not British. Right. You know, probably, you know, Middle Eastern, perhaps Turkish. We don't know a great deal about him, but, you know, he certainly wasn't white British, and yet we have this narrative at the moment, which is an inappropriate patriotism. So I want to recapture what is an appropriate patriotism to have, to be very proud of England, of our Englishness. But when we look deep within that, that has the values of a tolerant, caring, compassionate, outward focused people who have been shaped by different migrations over centuries, have been shaped by intolerance of groups of people, and how we have been intolerant to the other, and learnt from that. So I see some really deeply concerning things at the moment, but for me, there's something about holding a listening stillness in the shrill of debate to try to find what's at the core of the debate. Where are people's concerns, but also holding on to a vision of an appropriate patriotism?
Yeah, it's a really good answer. I have a favourite speech that whenever I'm giving a talk, more often than not, I'll find a way of crowbarring it into my talk. And it was given at the dawn of a new millennium by a man called Professor Elie Wiesel. And he was a survivor of the Holocaust, an amazing man, and Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he gave this stunning address at the White House. And it was titled "The Perils of Indifference." And he went on to say that actually the worst thing, above all of the punishment and the suffering, was the indifference of the majority towards that suffering. And I found it a very, very moving speech. For me, that's in many ways accented the way I live my life, where I'm trying to balance, and perhaps you can share some wisdom on this, how to remain accessible to the people, and even more so in your position, but who have differing opinions to me, or maybe share things from a different perspective, whilst not taking a position of convenient apathy or silence on subjects, to avoid division and to say nothing, or to speak up. Certainly in Professor Elie Wiesel's position, he would say, no, it's your responsibility to speak up when you see injustice. And Martin Luther King would be another example, and we could list those heroes of justice for me.
And we look back on history, and we so often see it's where there has been silence that the greatest evil has then been perpetuated. So, you know, we saw the time in the 1930s increasing intolerance towards marginalised groups, which then developed into the Holocaust. So I'm not saying we're anywhere near there at the moment, but there are some very deeply unpleasant things that we're seeing, and we need to build community cohesion. We need to build friendships, understanding, seeing the face of the other, so that we can treasure that we are a society of difference, seeking to build a better place together.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Middle East, if that's okay. Since we've touched upon the Holocaust, we've just passed the second anniversary of the October 7th attack and everything that's followed from it. Now, I understand you have some familiarity with that part of the world, but actually you were one of the last, potentially one of the last English visitors to Gaza prior to the war breaking out. What can you comment on about that?
Well, I was in Gaza on the 4th of October 2023, and I was in Israel on the day of the horrendous Hamas attacks. And I can remember going into the bomb shelter because the rockets were coming over, and I could hear the Israeli defense system intercepting rockets in those days. So I have a gut sense of a tiny bit of what that day had. But of course, for the families of hostages, for the hostages themselves, it's been the darkest of nights ever since, now for over 2 years. And we're recording this podcast on the day when there is hope that there may be an agreement towards the first track of a peace process. And we just must earnestly pray that that happens. Because I can't get out of my mind the people that I met in Gaza on that just days before, a creative, professional group of medics, doctors, nursing staff, administrators who run the Anglican Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza City. And that city has been hit 6 times now. Once by Hamas with a misfired rocket, so evil, but also by Israel as well. And of course, when that's challenged, there'll be an investigation, but there then seems never to be anything. And that hospital is at the cutting edge of so much healthcare in Gaza City, funded by Anglicans around the world, and not least in breast cancer and mammography. So that there can be early detection of breast cancer, because there isn't that facility, and so it was doing the work of Christian healing. And the chapel there where I prayed with the staff is dedicated to St. Philip. Of course, Philip was on his way to Gaza when he encountered the message of Christ, and we must pray that there is peace with justice for the Palestinian people, so that there can in some way be the living together of 2 groups in a peaceful way. And of course, there's all sorts of partnerships, lots of grassroots organisations that have done so much peace building. One of the ironies is that so many of the people who were murdered by Hamas were Jews from the kibbutzes around Gaza, who were very passionate about building peace with their neighbours, and, for example, would pick up people from Gaza at the border and take them to hospitals in Jerusalem for appointments and then take them back. And so they were really leading peacemakers, peace builders, peacekeepers. And so it shattered so much of Israeli society and the division as to what was the right and appropriate response. And of course, shattered so many dreams of people in Gaza and the West Bank who live a pretty challenging and difficult life day by day. And back in April, I was in the West Bank for a few days, just meeting people and seeing some of the conditions that they live under, and the threat to their land by illegal, under international law, illegal Israeli settlers. So I'm deeply concerned about the policies of the government of Israel at this time, and want to amplify those Israeli voices that are desperately calling for peace and want to build relationships with their Arab neighbours.
You mentioned international law. I'm conscious that that's becoming a dirty word in some circles. We've seen how there's even a movement in this country, a growing movement to abscond ourselves from the ECHR, from the European Court of Human Rights, and inconvenient international legislation preventing us from potentially deporting people, or for whatever reason they consider it to be obstructive to the benefit of our society. International law being the same as we're seeing in the Middle East, certain laws that are being ignored, potentially due to a position of power. My understanding of those laws they've set up in many ways with Christian principles, I see a very close link actually between human rights and the promotion of human rights coming from Christian principles, biblical principles. There's a great book, very difficult to read the whole of it, by Tom Holland.
Yeah, Dominion. It's fantastic.
Phenomenal.
Well, I encourage you to read the whole of it.
Because it
really does take you through how the Judeo-Christian concept of ethics and what I said, the dignity of the human being, and each person being made in the image, the wonderful image of God, treasured and precious, how that is infused so much around human rights and about international law.
I see that there's theology at play. Despite there being Christians and a Christian presence in Gaza, certainly I'm very conscious of people of a Christian faith having a very pro-Israeli position. Perhaps they don't mention or aren't as conscious of Christian populace within that part of the world. I'm also conscious of the fact that we became aware, didn't we, that on the Pope's passing, Pope Francis was having daily conversations with the church, with the Catholic Church within Gaza. I don't want to draw you into theology because it's complex, it's not necessarily relevant to this conversation, and it can be very divisive. But if you were my pastor, if you were my vicar, and I came to you and said, I've got friends on both sides of this one, who theologically believe that they need to see this re-establishment of Israel to bring about a second coming of Christ, and some that say that's a complete misinterpretation of the gospel. How do we both go forward without saying, well, listen, you stay over there, we'll stay over here, and we'll create these silos of difference? How do we pursue those commonalities between us across those theological differences?
Well, I think it's learning how do we disagree well together. How do we have good conversations, safe conversations that bring other voices into the room. So, for example, I do wonder if some of your friends who believe some of this have actually really sat down with a Palestinian Christian and heard their story as the living stones of that land, who can pray the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic as Jesus did. How they're rooted and connected to that land. And I think we've got to be very, very careful about fake news. Some of those who say fake news are those who are propagating the most fake news. So how do we find truth in this and really listen to those who are most marginalised, those who are most impacted, those for whom their human dignity has been reduced or extinguished?
When people talk about you, Bishop Graham, they often associate you with a passion for the environment. I understand you have an ecologist background. Where did that come from? Why is that, do you think, important to you?
Well, since a very early age, I've been fascinated in natural history and the wild world. And I was allowed as a child, so I grew up in a rural area, allowed to go and explore. And so that's really where that evolved. And I feel so very fortunate that I've got these sort of twin track of vocations of both the environment and also being a bishop at the moment. And in a sense, they fly in formation together, as both feed into each other. But I'm become acutely aware as we face these climate crises and biodiversity crisis. Incidentally, some of the people you've just been talking about who would come up with these views about Israel and the second coming of Jesus were there's a strong correlation with them also being climate deniers.
Bizarrely.
As well.
Yeah.
And what I've experienced from being part of this incredible global family of the Anglican Church, of Anglicans in all around the world, is that so many, particularly in the global south, particularly amongst the most poorest people on the face of this earth, economically poorest, are most impacted by climate change, biodiversity loss, yet are least resilient, least able to adapt. And that has become an increasing passion for me. They're my sisters and brothers in Christ, and I seek climate justice, biodiversity justice for them, so that they may find this life in all its fullness.
I was fortunate enough to go to Climate Week last year in New York. We've just had it again a few weeks ago. It coincide with UNGA. And what I thought was interesting, I mean, they have to come up with a schedule every year. How do we make this fresh and interesting? Because we're here again. But there was a noticeable difference in the rhetoric in that people had stopped talking about what if we, how do we keep below this threshold, this climate temperature threshold, to now, what do we do if we don't? You could feel this pitch changes. It doesn't look like we're going to, actually. In fact, we're probably going to thrash straight through it. What does that mean? And it was a little alarming, actually, to come away less hopeful that there's this political unity around this general acknowledgement that climate change is a real thing. You've seen how politically that's being besmirched by climate deniers.
This last week issued a statement when Kemi Badenoch came out with a whole load of rubbish, quite frankly, about abolishing the Climate Change Act, and that is one of a really good piece of legislation. I'm afraid it's all about whistling, to try and attract votes, rather than what politicians should be doing, which is the right thing for people, for planet, for our future.
Yeah, I agree. Moving on to more hopeful things. We've got a new Archbishop.
Yes.
Literally as a matter of days ago. And you, I understand, were involved in that election process. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there was this speculation that I was a potential candidate, and I think I was 3-1 at Ladbrokes at one point.
3-1? Gosh, you're a favourite.
And I was, I had no sense of inner calling. I'm so happy being the Bishop of Norwich and the portfolio of things I do here. And so I offered to be elected to the committee that nominates the name of somebody to the King. And I was elected to that, and so have been heavily involved in the selection process, which involved vast amounts of work. And I'm just thrilled and delighted that Bishop Sarah Mullally is to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury, because she is the best person to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, in my view, at this time. She brings immense skills, particularly because she was formerly the chief nurse for England. So her pastoral skills, her skills at convening people, of seeking healing and ways forward, I think are what we need in this season. So I am so thrilled that she said yes. Because in a sense, anyone who wants to be the Archbishop of Canterbury should never become the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Have some reticence.
There is a sense, as in days of old, they should be dragged. And so I'm very, very relieved that Bishop Sarah, at the end of this whole process, said yes to God and yes to the call of the church. And I really look forward to seeing what happens under her watch, under her stewardship, under her care.
To some, her appointment is controversial by matter of her gender. But what do you think are going to be some of her greatest challenges taking on this incredibly difficult role in an increasingly divided society and an increasingly divided church?
I think some of the biggest challenge, I'm going to answer this question slightly differently, will be about maintaining who she is as a human being under the sight of God, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, that first call in her life, being true to that, balancing this ministry with a home life and a private life, and a life where she gets resourced and encouraged and energized. I think another challenge will be just daily knowing whatever rubbish is being thrown at her, and I'm afraid there has been some absolutely diabolical misogyny and worse from people who claim to be Christians. And that's appalling. And it's maintaining her own sense of dignity throughout all that, her resilience, knowing that she is loved. And those loud voices, just as in the swimming pool, often come from the shallow end. And there are many, many of us, and I've had messages from throughout the world and from other Christian denominations saying how excited they are and that they're praying for her.
Yeah, fabulous. I run a charity that protects children from sexual exploitation. It would be remiss of me not to mention that one of the causes of Archbishop Justin Welby's stepping down was an association with safeguarding, and I noticed that in Sarah's, Archbishop Sarah, her opening address...
Bishop Sarah at the moment.
Bishop Sarah to be, Archbishop to be. She brought that up. You know, the news is a huge story, her appointment, but even in her first public addresses, she sort of brought the issue of safeguarding front and centre. That seems to be something I would imagine she's going to be prioritising. Is that something that was discussed in that process, or is that something that she believes she's called to pursue as a priority?
And of course, it was absolutely discussed. It's a major issue of our time, dealing with the sin and criminality of the past and the present, so that the future may be safer for everyone. It's something that absolutely daily is part of my role. It's something I've got antennae out for the whole of the time and try to model in my own practice through safeguarding training and the culture I'm trying to develop the very best, so that we protect not only children but vulnerable adults, indeed all people, from any sense of harm when they come into contact with the life of the church. And Bishop Sarah is very, very strong on that, and that was one of the gifts and qualities, the culture, character that members of the Crown Nominations Commission saw in her, and indeed in other candidates, that we saw was being very important.
Brilliant. We talked a lot about challenges, but as we close, I thought it would be lovely for you to identify something that gives you hope about this world, hope about the future.
When I go into schools in this diocese, and we have over 100 Church of England primary schools, the vast majority of them have an eco group. And because of my interest in this area, I usually I enjoy spending time with that group. And we talk about things, and I listen very, very carefully to them. And that gives me hope, because there isn't the apathy, there isn't the cynicism, there isn't the we can't do anything. There is a genuine sense of wanting to live in a better planet, in a better place with people, and the kind of that early innocence of childhood, which actually doesn't see racism, doesn't see all the other sort of phobias that there can be. They're all learnt by us, they're all taught to us, they're all seep into us, and that gives me hope for what the future can be. And we need to kind of kindle that and encourage it and not stamp it out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this morning.
And you. Thank you, Bryn.